Cryptic clues. Cryptic clues. Cryptic clues.
Welcome to my channel, where every story pulls you into a new mystery. Every case tests your instincts, and every clue brings us one step closer to the truth. In today's case, we follow Miss Marple as she visits a quiet countryside manor, where every night, at precisely 3 o'clock, a window creaks open on its own. No draft, no movement, and no explanation. Only the cold air that follows. As if something invisible has entered the room. Stay with me till the end. Because when Miss Marple discovers who last touched that window, the truth will chill you far more than the night breeze ever could. So, pick up your cup of tea and get comfortable, because today's case is worth every second. Until the very end. Chapter 1. A pleasant day turned grim. It had been the kind of golden afternoon that only St. Anscombe-on-Mere seemed to produce. A sleepy village nestled among rolling English hills, framed by dry stone walls and hedgerows frothing with late summer blossom. Birds sang with an almost excessive cheeriness. Children scampered down the village green chasing hoops, and the bunting from last week's summer fete still hung gaily across the tea shop and the post office, fading now in the sun. At the western edge of the village, beyond the cricket ground and the duck pond, the manor gates of Westerham House stood open for the first time in nearly a decade. Lady Sybil Hayward, widow of the late Sir Archibald Hayward and former chairwoman of the County Antiquarian Society, had finally consented to host the Historical Society's summer garden luncheon. Invitations had been handwritten on ivory vellum. Cold game pies and elderflower cordial had been promised. Even the vicar had agreed to forego his usual Sunday walk to attend. Miss Marple, modestly seated in a wicker chair near the hydrangeas, sipped her tea and observed the assembled company with an air of polite detachment. She was dressed in pale lavender, her head a sensible straw with a plum ribbon that had seen the last 3 summers. Her eyes, however, were bright and sharp behind their delicate spectacles, sharp enough to notice that Mrs. Fanshawe had not touched her treacle tart, that young Oliver Jennings had retied his shoelaces twice in 10 minutes, and that the new schoolmistress, Miss Elspeth Dyer, though soft-spoken, watched everyone with barely concealed tension. The air, perfumed with honeysuckle and a faint waft of varnish from the newly polished deck chairs, seemed tranquil enough. But if you'd lived in a village as long as Miss Marple had, you came to understand that tranquility was often a rather artful disguise. At precisely 3:30, just as Lady Sybil was delivering a rambling toast to the preservation of our proud local history, a loud crash rang out from within the manor house, followed by the unmistakable sound of shattering glass. Gasps fluttered like startled birds. Several guests dropped their forks. The vicar fumbled his serviette. Lady Sybil blinked owlishly and muttered, "Good heavens," before slowly turning toward the house. Miss Marple rose not hurriedly, but with the quiet certainty of one who had heard such sounds before. Her eyes flicked upward to the east-facing wing of the manor, to the wide sash window that had, moments before, been tightly shut. It now stood open, the lace curtain caught by no breeze because, of course, there was none. The housekeeper, Mrs. Bowyer, came stumbling across the lawn, her white apron flapping, her eyes wild. "It's Mr. Felix," she cried. He's fallen from the library window." Panic burst through the gathering like wind through dry leaves. Felix Cargill, Lady Sybil's nephew and heir, a lean, brooding man recently returned from India, was known for his brusque manner and a suspicious interest in liquidating the Hayward estate. Now, apparently, he had been liquidated himself. Miss Marple moved swiftly, but without fluster. "Perhaps someone ought to telephone Dr. Morland," she said gently, placing her teacup on a stone birdbath, "though I fear it may be too late for such remedies." Indeed, by the time they reached him sprawled beneath the library window on the gravel walk, his head at an unnatural angle, blood blooming into the creases of his collar. It was clear that Mr. Felix Cargill was beyond the reach of medicine. One of his shoes had come off. His spectacles, oddly, were still perched upon his nose. "I always found him rather unlikable," whispered Mrs. Fanshawe to no one in particular. "Suicide, do you think?" asked the vicar, already fishing for meaning in the air. "Or an accident?" offered Colonel Grimble, his mustache twitching. "Old houses, loose sills, one leans out too far." But Miss Marple said nothing. She stood apart, eyes lifted again to that high, solitary window. There was no sign of broken frame or struggling curtain. The glass shards on the path glittered in the sun, but the frame itself appeared entirely intact. The wind, too, remained absent. And that, she thought, was rather peculiar. Lady Sybil was seated on a bench, white as clotted cream, dabbing at her brow with a lace kerchief. Miss Elspeth Dyer had quietly vanished from the group. Oliver Jennings stood pale and rigid near the edge of the gravel, as though afraid to move. The village constable, young Inspector Henry Ledger, had arrived by then, summoned by a maid who had fainted upon seeing the body. He looked overwhelmed before he even crossed the threshold. To his credit, he quickly began ushering guests to the lawn and attempted to secure the scene. Miss Marple stepped delicately over a glass fragment. "Dear me," she murmured, "it's never just a fall, is it?" Ledger glanced at her, frowning. "Beg pardon, Miss Marple?" She smiled gently, the expression almost motherly. "Oh, nothing at all, dear. Just thinking how curious it is that a man might fall from a closed window. Unless, of course, it wasn't quite so closed as it seemed." And with that, she returned to the shade, picked up her knitting basket, and resumed a half-finished row of moss stitch round her. The village of St. Anscombe-on-Mere reeled with speculation, scandal, and that delicious undercurrent of fear that only a fresh corpse could bring to the summer roses. The window had opened without wind, and Miss Marple, already, had begun to suspect why. Chapter 2. The village reacts. Gossip and theories. Be the following morning. The death of Mr. Felix Cargill had settled like a fog across St. Anscombe-on-Mere. Not the kind of fog one sees creeping across the downs, but the sort that clings to every whispered conversation, every teacup clink, and every sit-along glance exchanged between shopkeepers and customers. The bakery, naturally, had at first Mrs. Partridge, who had been behind the counter for 30 years and could weigh a stone of flour, without glancing at the scale, passed a fresh rye loaf to Mr. Appleton and said in a tone meant to suggest. She wasn't suggesting anything. "Well, I suppose if a man's found at the bottom of a window with no wind to blame, you'd want to ask who was inside, wouldn't you?" Mr. Appleton, a retired solicitor with a fondness for chess and deductions of any kind, murmured, or why the window was opened at all. At the greengrocer's, Mrs. Fanshawe was seen gesturing dramatically near the onions. "Pushed, if you ask me. Poor Sybil, her own nephew. Oh, the family's been cursed for generations. Remember her great-uncle's scandal in Vienna? The vicar, Reverend Paul Underbarrow, preached that morning on the fleetingness of life and the suddenness with which the Lord calls us to judgment. He did not mention windows, but spoke pointedly about men who build towers of ambition and tumble by their own design." Miss Marple, however, declined her usual place in the pews. She remained at home on Old Mill Lane, crocheting a table runner and receiving two callers before noon. The first was Mrs. Lavinia Drake, a stout woman of some influence on the parish committee, who arrived ostensibly to discuss the upcoming flower show, but within moments found herself saying, "Of course, it's all rather tragic. Jane Felix wasn't what one would call popular, but still, it's not as if he deserved." She trailed off. Miss Marple offered tea and said nothing of the sort. "I do wonder," Mrs. Drake continued, whether Lady Sybil will go through with the Historical Society's new bursary fund now. It was Felix's idea, after all, and if there's been unpleasantness, Miss Marple raised her eyes. Do you think it was unpleasantness, Lavinia? Mrs. Drake faltered. Well, I hardly know what to think, but Mrs. Fanshawe says she saw someone crying behind the hedge just after the body was found. Oh, Miss Marple tilted her head. She won't say who, but crying, Jane. Quite unlike anyone at a garden party, wouldn't you say? Yes, Miss Marple said. Unless, of course, one had just witnessed a death. Then it might be entirely like someone at a garden party. Mrs. Drake departed not long after. Faintly flustered, she had hoped, as many did, to glean some firm opinion from Miss Marple, who, being elderly and unobtrusive, was assumed to spend most of her time forming quietly accurate assessments of everyone around her. She did, but she rarely announced them aloud. The second caller was more unexpected. Young Oliver Jennings, no more than 25, in a wrinkled linen coat and boots he hadn't polished. He worked part-time as a clerk at the solicitor's office and was known for his unfortunate romantic entanglement the previous spring, though not with whom. He stood on Miss Marple's porch looking pale and rather shaken. I'm sorry, Miss Marple. I don't mean to intrude. I keep going over it in my head, you see, and Miss Marple opened the door wider. Why don't you come in, dear boy? It's no trouble. He sat uneasily in her sitting room, picking at the hem of his sleeve. I saw him fall, he blurted. Felix, she poured tea. You were in the garden? Yes, just behind the fountain. I wasn't even really part of the luncheon. I'd only just arrived to deliver a document for Lady Sybil when it all happened. And then he came down, awfully fast, and I froze. Miss Marple offered a biscuit, which he took but did not eat. What sort of document? She asked. He looked at her with something between admiration and worry. You do ask the right questions. It was a deed. Property transfer. I didn't read the contents, it was sealed, but I know the type. Interesting. But Miss Marple, he said, leaning forward, voice low, the thing is, I looked up, afterward. Instinct, you know, to see where he'd fallen from. The window, it wasn't open when I arrived. It was shut, and when I looked again, after he'd fallen, it was wide open. Miss Marple folded her hands. Oliver bit his lip. You think I'm imagining it, don't you? Not at all, she said kindly. But one must remember that fear and shock often rearrange the sequence of memory, and yet, sometimes it sharpens it. He left soon after, his brow furrowed. By mid-afternoon, Westerham House had been cordoned off by the police, though nobody believed the villagers would respect that boundary in spirit. Constable Ledger had made two statements, one to the press, which amounted to, investigations are ongoing, and one privately to the vicar, in which he confided that nothing about the angle of the fall makes sense. The library, from which Mr. Cargill had allegedly fallen, was a second-story room with floor-to-ceiling windows, one of which had been smashed outward, yet the shards of glass were found entirely beneath the body, as though something had forced its way through after his descent. Rumors grew like brambles. Felix had enemies, certainly. He had argued loudly with Lady Sybil 2 days prior. He had reportedly dismissed Mrs. Bowyer for untidiness. He had been seen taking evening walks alone toward the old chapel ruins, strange for a man who professed no interest in history, and he had, some whispered, recently made inquiries into selling the western paddock to a housing firm in Swindon. But suicide, the village wasn't convinced. Felix had been brusque, yes, but confident, not the sort to leap from a window during luncheon. And besides, the window had been closed, hadn't it? Miss Marple returned to her small garden after tea, tying up sweet peas and brushing soil from her gloves. She did not need to chase theories. They always came to her. People said things, revealed things, when they believed she was only half listening. Already she had catalogued for half-truths, 3 unnecessary apologies, and 1 rather telling silence. She sat for a moment on the garden bench, the hum of bees around her, and thought about young Oliver's visit, about a window that should not have opened, about crying behind a hedge, and an heir who might no longer be heir, across the green. The bunting still fluttered faintly, as though the fate would never quite end. But the village knew better. The game had begun. Chapter 3. The first clues and suspicions be Tuesday morning. The bunting had finally come down, packed away by the vicar's wife under the pretext of seasonal tidiness. In truth, it had become something of an embarrassment to Festive. Too cheerful, in light of Mr. Cargill's sudden and rather unorthodox death. The mood across St. Anscombe-on-Mere had turned from scandalous excitement to a muted, uncertain tension. There was no announcement of funeral arrangements. Lady Sybil had retreated into the west wing of Westerham House, and was said to be refusing all visitors except the family solicitor, Mr. Gideon Perks. The library window remained covered with a heavy canvas tarp, and the garden path where Felix had fallen had been cleared of all glass, scrubbed and sanded. The only sign that anything unusual had occurred was a faint patch of scuffed gravel and the absence of a hydrangea bush that had been uprooted during the commotion. But Miss Marple believed in traces not just in the physical sense, but in the way people behaved when they thought they oughtn't be watched. She walked down the high street that morning not to gawk or gossip, but to listen. She stopped in at the post office, pretending to look over the greeting cards, while behind her, Mrs. Mapleton whispered to her assistant, said he hadn't a scratch on his hands. Imagine that. Fell from a window, and no scrapes, nothing, just the neck. At the grocer's, she overheard Mr. Carruthers the butcher remark, and his spectacles didn't even fall off, stayed right on his nose. Curious, that, curious indeed. She returned home just after elevenses and found a note tucked under her doorstep, written on cheap line paper. No envelope, no name, Miss Marple. There's something about that window that don't sit right. I saw a man inside the library just after it happened, but he vanished before the police came. Not Felix, someone else. I'm not mad. Thought you should know. No signature, no handwriting she recognized. But the word don't had been struck through and corrected to doesn't, suggesting someone who worried about impressions. Miss Marple slipped the note into her sewing basket and made her way, as if on a whim, toward Westerham House. She met Inspector Ledger just outside the gates. He looked tired and a touch irritable. "Good morning, Inspector," she said pleasantly. "Miss Marple." He replied, tugging at the brim of his cap. "Not here to inspect the crime scene, I hope." "Oh no," she said, "though I did wonder if Lady Sybil required any assistance with her linens. These grand houses often neglect practical things when there's a fuss." He gave her a look that was not unkind. "No entry today, I'm afraid. The solicitor's inside with her." "Very hush-hush, quite right," said Miss Marple. "The law always prefers to work quietly." She waited until the inspector turned to answer a question from the constable on duty, and then glanced up at the library window. The canvas cover flapped gently in the still air. She noticed just at the edge of the sill what appeared to be a faint, reddish smear along the wood. Too high to be from Felix's fall, she thought, and not quite at the right angle. Later that afternoon, she received a call from Dr. Morland. "I thought you might like to know," he said, his tone always formal but not unfriendly, "that the postmortem on Mr. Cargill revealed some unusual findings." Miss Marple didn't press. She waited, no bruising on the hands or forearms. The doctor continued, "Which is odd. One generally tries to break one's fall. But here nothing, and the angle of impact suggests the body came down straight, rather than tumbling. As though he were unconscious before he fell." There was a pause. It's not impossible. Any traces of substances? Nothing conclusive. But I've requested additional toxicology. Thank you, Doctor, Miss Marple said. It's good of you to call. She hung up, her fingers lightly drumming the receiver. So. No sign of defensive wounds. A fall to clean. A note from an anonymous watcher. A red smear on the window ledge. That evening, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Bowyer, the housekeeper of Westerham House. They had known each other for years, ever since Mrs. Bowyer's late sister had served at the rectory. Mrs. Bowyer had aged since Miss Marple last saw her. Her face was drawn, and her eyes puffy with lack of sleep. It's all turned upside down, she said, shaking her head as she poured tea into mismatched china. Lady Sybil's locked herself away. Mr. Perks is coming and going like a bad smell. And the staff, well, half of them want to leave. Can't sleep, can't eat. Miss Marple sipped politely. I wonder, she said, was the library usually kept locked? Mrs. Bowyer frowned. Not locked, no, but shut. Mr. Felix was particular about that. Didn't like anyone going in unless he was present. Said the books were rare. Did he often read? Mrs. Bowyer gave a dry little laugh. Only if it involved profit. He was sorting through the old ledgers, if you want the truth, looking for ways to reclaim value, as he put it. Trying to sell anything not nailed down. Miss Marple folded her hands. And the window? Mrs. Bowyer's face darkened. It's been stuck for years, ever since the storm of '39 warped the frame. Wouldn't budge. That's what I can't understand, Miss Marple. How it could have opened at all, let alone cleanly. Miss Marple nodded, setting her cup down with a gentle clink. Thank you, dear. You've been very helpful. As she walked back along the lane, dusk gathering around her like a shawl, she considered the facts. A man who never broke his fall. A locked room with a window that hadn't opened in years suddenly open, and not from within. Spectacles intact, hands clean, and now a window stuck for decades miraculously flung wide. Without a gust of wind. Miss Marple knew better than to believe in miracles. She turned the corner just in time to glimpse a figure standing very still outside the gate to Westerham House, young, pale, arms crossed, watching the house with that expression somewhere between anger and fear. Miss Elspeth Dyer, the new schoolmistress, who had quietly vanished after the fall. Miss Marple adjusted her hat, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Tomorrow, she thought, she would call on Miss Dyer and perhaps bring scones, for there were questions still to be asked, and Miss Marple intended to ask them all. Chapter 4. Miss Marple quietly observest following morning dawn clear and dry, with the sun sharpening the edges of every hedge and rooftop in St. Anscombe-on-Mere. The village was still, as though the birds had agreed, for once, to keep their chatter to themselves. Miss Marple, armed with a basket of warm scones wrapped in a linen cloth, made her way to the modest cottage let out to the new schoolmistress, Miss Elspeth Dyer. The house, tucked neatly at the edge of town near the boundary stones, had ivy curling up the trellis and a single hollyhock listing in the breeze. She knocked twice. Miss Dyer opened the door in a housecoat and slippers, clearly surprised to see anyone, let alone the village's most gently formidable resident. Her dark eyes widened, and for a moment her mouth worked without sound. "Good morning, my dear," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I hope I'm not intruding. I thought perhaps you hadn't had time to visit the bakery." Miss Dyer hesitated, then stood back. No, not at all. Please do come in. I wasn't expecting anyone." A small flush rose to her cheek. No one. The sitting room was clean, but sparsely furnished. One armchair, a writing desk near the window, and a small bookshelf neatly arranged by subject. On the windowsill, a single teacup rested atop a stack of essays to be marked. Miss Marple took her seat without ceremony and offered the basket. "Lemon and currant," I find they comfort the mind as well as the stomach, particularly after such an eventful weekend. Miss Dyer poured tea with trembling fingers. She seemed determined to appear composed, but her every movement gave her away, the way she paused before speaking, the way her eyes flicked toward the window, as though expecting something to peer back in. You weren't at the garden luncheon long, Miss Marple said. I scarcely saw you before. Well, no, Miss Dyer murmured. I arrived late. I had a headache and almost didn't go at all. How unfortunate. Did you see anything from the lawn? Miss Dyer stared into her cup. Just the aftermath. The scream. Everyone running. It's all a blur, indeed. Blurs are very common during such times. But sometimes it's the smallest things that return to us later. A silence followed. The clock ticked gently. Outside, a blackbird chirped, and then fell quiet. Miss Marple gently changed the subject, inquiring after the school, the children's summer reading habits, the poor quality of the new chalk. It was only after the tension began to drain from Miss Dyer's shoulders that she said, very lightly, I've always found that windows are rather telling. Miss Dyer blinked. Windows? Yes, my dear. One forgets how many people believe a closed window stays closed, when in truth, it depends on the person who last touched it, or who never did. Miss Dyer's knuckles whitened around her teacup. You see, Miss Marple continued, I spoke to Mrs. Bowyer yesterday. She says that library window hasn't opened properly in nearly a decade. Yet Felix Cargill managed to fall from it, and somehow it was wide open after. Miss Dyer set her cup down to hard. I'm sure I wouldn't know anything about that. Of course not, Miss Marple said gently. Still, it must be troubling, so near your cottage, that house. So many years empty, then suddenly alive with people again. And now, not so much. Miss Dyer stood abruptly. I really should be marking these. Thank you for the scones. Miss Marple rose too, calmly, taking her basket. Of course, dear. Do take care of yourself. She left the house with the quiet certainty of a woman who had not gathered all the facts, but had at least confirmed a vital thing, that Miss Dyer was afraid. And fear, Miss Marple knew, was rarely without reason. On her way home, she passed the village green and noticed young Oliver Jennings seated on the bench, near the old war memorial, tossing breadcrumbs to a small congregation of pigeons. He looked up and smiled, then flushed when he saw her. Miss Marple, he said, have they arrested anyone yet? No, dear. The investigation is still ongoing. I heard they're blaming the storm that warped the window years ago. Said it loosened the frame enough that someone might have managed it. Miss Marple sat beside him. But no storm recently, HMM? He shook his head. No, but I suppose they'll find something. They always do. Not always, Miss Marple said. Sometimes it's rather up to the people who notice what others ignore. He hesitated, then glanced sideways. There's something I didn't tell you before. She waited. I saw someone, he said slowly, just before Felix fell. A shadow or someone moving away from the window, not leaning out, like they'd finished something. Why didn't you say so? I thought I imagined it, or that no one would believe me. I wasn't even supposed to be in the garden. Miss Marple nodded. And yet you were there. You saw a man fall from a window. That places you, inconveniently, at the heart of things. Oliver looked down. It didn't look like Felix. That caught her attention. What do you mean? The figure. The one in the library. It was taller, I think, or at least broader. Felix wasn't exactly built for physical work. This person moved like someone used to it. Miss Marple patted his hand. Thank you, Oliver. That's very helpful. By late afternoon, a steady drizzle had begun to fall, blurring the outlines of trees and houses and giving the village a soft, uncertain shape like a watercolor before it dries. Miss Marple sat by her fireplace, knitting basket beside her, reviewing the day's observations. Miss Dyer's fear, Oliver's shadow, a figure in the library seen but not identified, a stuck window unstuck, and Felix, dead with clean hands and an unruffled collar. There were too many people eager to believe in tragic accidents or sudden suicides, but Miss Marple had known enough people, enough human nature to sense something deeper. People killed for love, for money, for revenge, or sometimes simply to preserve a lie. But rarely did they do so neatly. She made a note in her diary before retiring. A single line: Felix didn't fall. He was presented. And with that quiet conclusion, she turned down the lamp, the knitting still unfinished, and let the night close in. Tomorrow, she thought, would bring something new. It always did. Chapter 5, First Suspects. The police think. It's simple tragedy at Westerham. Police suspect tragic fall. The accompanying article penned by the ever-earnest Miss Louisa Clem from the paper's Village column quoted Inspector Ledger as saying that no clear evidence of foul play has been discovered, and that, until contrary evidence arises, the death of Mr. Felix Cargill is being treated as a probable accident, or, as Mr. Appleton muttered over breakfast at the tea room, which is another way of saying, we don't know, but we'd rather not keep digging. Miss Marple sat at her usual table near the window, quietly buttering a scone, her eyes scanning the faces that passed by. People were walking a little faster than usual, speaking a little quieter, a subtle shift in village atmosphere, the kind that only someone like Miss Marple would notice. Inspector Ledger, meanwhile, was feeling pressure of a different sort. He had spent the better part of 3 days navigating contradictory witness accounts, vague observations, and a crime scene that, if it was a crime at all, offered nothing so accommodating as fingerprints, blood spatters, or missing murder weapons. And then there was Elspeth Dyer. Ledger had visited her early that morning, prompted partly by a tip from Mrs. Fanshawe, who claimed that Miss Dyer was behaving awfully quiet for someone who'd been so close to the house. He found her nervously dusting her windowsill. You arrived late to the garden party? Ledger asked. Yes, she said, not meeting his gaze. I wasn't feeling well. I only stayed 10 minutes before the fall. Did you see anything? No, she said, too quickly. Nothing. Just the aftermath. Ledger made note of her tone, but said nothing. On the way out, he noticed a small framed photograph on her hall table. A younger version of Miss Dyer stood beside a much older woman in a wheelchair, their expressions unreadable. That same afternoon, Inspector Ledger returned to Westerham House to meet Lady Sybil. She received him in the morning room, curtained, dim and heavy with the scent of dried lavender. She looked older than she had 3 days ago, her hair looser, her voice softer. I understand you've come to a conclusion, Inspector, she said without looking at him. We believe, Ledger began, that Mr. Cargill leaned too far out the library window, perhaps, to retrieve something fallen onto the sill and lost his footing. The frame was old, the drop sudden. Lady Sybil's mouth twitched slightly. How curious. Felix was not, as you may have observed, a man inclined to risk his footing for anything. Ledger cleared his throat. We've no evidence to suggest anyone else was in the room at the time. No fingerprints but his on the sill. No sign of forced entry. And yet someone, Lady Sybil turned to face him, her eyes glinting through the gloom, managed to open a window that hasn't budged in 10 years. Ledger faltered. We believe it may have been loosened by the recent heat. What expands, warps, then contracts. I see, she said. And how convenient. Ledger stood, a touch embarrassed. If you recall anything else, anything unusual in his behavior, please let me know, Inspector, she said gently. Everything about Felix was unusual, but if you're looking for something that made him worth killing, you'll need more imagination than a warped window frame. Later that evening, Ledger confided in his constable, a young and enthusiastic man named Harrow, that the old bird still has claws. Miss Marple, meanwhile, was making her own quiet observations at the chemist's. She overheard Mrs. Drake purchasing valerian drops for sleep and inquiring rather clumsily if any stronger sedatives had recently been sold without prescription at the library. Young Oliver Jennings returned a book 2 days early, The Legal Structure of Inheritance Law in Rural Estates, and avoided eye contact when Miss Marple greeted him. She also stopped to examine the war memorial bench, where she'd previously spoken with him. She found a crumpled sweet wrapper beneath it, a brand not sold in the village shop, imported. Unusual. Later that night, she jotted a quiet line into her notebook. Outsiders leave crumbs. Locals conceal them. Back at Westerham House, something finally broke. Mrs. Bowyer flushed and breathless burst into the kitchen, where the cook and the new parlour-maid were cleaning up supper. "I found it," she gasped. "I found what he was doing in the library." She held aloft a folder marked Private Westerham Trust. Inside, an unsigned draft agreement, a full estate dissolution. Felix had been planning to sell Westerham House in pieces, starting with the old chapel ruins and the paddock to the north. It was all typed up, she whispered, pale now. He was going to tell Lady Sybil this week. Said he'd found a loophole in the will. The servant stared. Who else knew? The cook asked. Mrs. Bowyer opened her mouth, then paused. I think someone did. The next morning, the newspaper revised its tone. Inheritance wrangle at Westerham. New questions in Cargill death. Miss Marple clipped the article with care and pinned it to the inside of her diary. The village believed the police had decided, but she knew better. The facts didn't align. The instinct scratched at the back of her mind. And the people were talking too much or not at all. A warped window, a dead air, a secret plan to sell off legacy stone by stone. Miss Marple sat down with her morning tea and carefully threaded her needle into a fresh square of linen. Each stitch told a story, and she was very nearly ready to begin the border. Chapter 6, A Hidden Clue. Overlooked, but Thomas Marple had long believed that the things most worth knowing were often hidden in plain sight, not in what people said, but in what they neglected to say, not in grand gestures, but in small, accidental details. And so, on Saturday morning, she did what she often did when her thoughts needed gentle stirring. She visited the churchyard. It was quiet beneath the limes, the grass dappled in morning light. The headstones, weathered and moss-lined, stood in patient silence. Miss Marple wasn't visiting anyone in particular, though she often said. The dead made more polite company than the living. She walked slowly past the Hayward family plot, where Sir Archibald's resting place had recently been cleaned. A new brass plaque had been affixed to the stone. Felix Cargill, however, had not yet been laid to rest. His grave, if there would be one, remained unmarked near the chapel wall. Something caught her attention. A crow feather, glossy black, unnatural in its stillness, lay upon a narrow strip of white fabric. Miss Marple crouched carefully. The fabric was linen, frayed at one edge. Not a handkerchief, a cuff. She turned it over, noting the faint smear of what appeared to be red wax, or lipstick, or possibly chalk dust. Curious, tucking the scrap gently into her pocket, she stood and turned to find the vicar watching her from the path, his hands behind his back. Miss Marple, he said with a cordial nod, you've an eye for lost things, I see. Not lost, Reverend. Discarded. He smiled faintly. There's a difference, a subtle one. But yes, she didn't elaborate. He walked beside her for a moment in silence. Then, without prompting, he said, I performed the funeral for Felix's father some years ago. The man had presence, if not warmth. Felix, on the other hand, I always felt he mistook cruelty for cleverness. Miss Marple glanced at him. And yet the village accepted him, the vicar sighed. One accepts many things one doesn't admire. That is, after all, how institutions function. Miss Marple gave him a look both amused and grim. Quite so. That afternoon, she visited the village tailor, Mr. Quentin Webb, whose memory for fabric, buttons, and fraying collars rivaled even hers. He examined the cuff with a practiced eye. Yes, I recognize this stitching. Not local. French, I'd say machine finished, but with hand-reinforced edges. From a formal shirt. Expensive. Recently laundered. Could it belong to Felix? Mr. Webb made a face. Felix dressed well enough, but his shirts were starchy British affairs. Stiff cuffs, monogrammed in dull thread. This one's more rakish. Dare I say, more romantic. Someone passing through, perhaps? Perhaps. Or someone pretending not to be from here. Miss Marple left his shop with a slow sense of confirmation. Someone else had been close enough to lose a cuff, likely during a struggle, possibly near the time of the fall, and the presence of red chalk or lipstick. What might that suggest? Back at home, she opened her sewing basket and withdrew the anonymous note she'd been left earlier that week. She examined it now with new interest. The paper was ruled school style, perhaps, and had the same faint, reddish smudge at the margin. Chalk dust. And only one profession in the village used red chalk regularly. She fetched her magnifying glass and looked again. The handwriting controlled. Careful. The loops of the GS closed deliberately. She thought of Miss Dyer's bookshelf, the neat desk, the windowsill, carefully dusted, and the woman's trembling fingers round her teacup. Miss Marple had, of course, already suspected Elspeth Dyer had seen more than she'd said. Now she wondered if she had done more, too. But she would not confront her yet. Timing was important. In fact, it was everything. The next day, an unexpected visitor appeared at Miss Marple's gate. Gideon Perks, the Hayward family solicitor. Tall, spare, and wrapped perpetually in tweed. He looked every inch the cautious bureaucrat. But there was something in his manner, something coiled, like a snake beneath ivy. Miss Marple, he said, removing his hat, might I impose on a few minutes of your time? Of course, Mr. Perks, she said, though I doubt I'm of any use to you. Oh, on the contrary, he replied with an oily smile. It seems everyone in this village thinks you're of great use. She offered him tea, which he declined. I'll be direct, he said, perching on the edge of her sitting-room chair. I've reason to believe certain parties are misinterpreting the situation at Westerham House, and I'd like to prevent unfounded rumors, such as, Miss Marple asked mildly, that Felix Cargill's death was anything other than unfortunate misadventure. The press is becoming emboldened. There's talk of an inquest, disruption, expense, reputational risk. Miss Marple looked at him steadily. You're worried about Lady Sybil's standing? He hesitated. Yes, that, and the integrity of the estate. The longer uncertainty persists, the harder it is to ensure a stable transition. Transition to whom? She asked softly. Perks blinked. There's no direct heir. Legally, the estate reverts to a trust unless Lady Sybil names a beneficiary, which she has not yet done. How curious, Miss Marple said. Felix once told Mrs. Bowyer he'd found a loophole in the will. But of course, I'm sure you knew that already. Perks rose abruptly. Good day, Miss Marple, she smiled. Do take care. After he left, Miss Marple considered what had not been said. Perks hadn't asked her to cease investigating. He hadn't denied Felix's legal maneuverings. He'd only tried to redirect the narrative to smooth the fabric of the village's understanding, before it frayed too much, which meant something was very much at stake. Later that evening, a storm rolled in, rattling the windows and drumming against the roof tiles. Miss Marple lit a fire and reviewed her notes, a foreign cuff, a red smear, an anonymous letter with schoolroom chalk, a missing heir, and a lawyer too eager to declare normalcy. As the rain lashed the garden, Miss Marple picked up her embroidery. She threaded her needle once more, this time with red thread. The same shade, she thought, as that strange, dusty stain. Chapter 7. Confrontations and Secrets. Sunday after the storm, the village awoke to branches strewn across the lanes, and the sound of rooks shrieking from the church steeple. Miss Marple, however, had risen with the first light and was already clipping the edges of her hydrangeas when she saw Mrs. Fanshawe head askew, gloves mismatched, storming down the lane with the dramatic flair of someone intent on confrontation. "They're saying it's suicide, Jane," Mrs. Fanshawe burst out before even reaching the gate. "Absolute nonsense, and I won't stand for it. You know as well as I do, Felix Cargill was many things, but he didn't brood. Brooding types don't push for land development and squabble over tea, about how many chimneys they can tear down. Do come in," Miss Marple said calmly, brushing her hands on her apron. "I've just made a fresh pot." Inside, Mrs. Fanshawe paced the parlor like a kettle ready to whistle. "I've lived here 38 years, Jane, 38. And I know when something's being buried that oughtn't." Mrs. Bowyer says she heard raised voices coming from the library the night before the garden luncheon, but now she's gone silent. Won't say another word, won't even look anyone in the eye. Miss Marple stirred her tea gently. "Do you think someone warned her? Either that, or frightened her. And not a soul in this village seems to be asking why. Everyone's just letting the inspector tuck it away in his little notebook like a lost cat." She leaned in. "I hear Felix had a falling out with Mr. Perks. That's not in the paper. They argued over an inheritance clause. And if Perks loses control of the estate, well, no more tidy fees, do you see?" "I see very well," Miss Marple said. "Something's not right, and someone is making sure it stays not right." After Mrs. Fanshawe departed in a cloud of lavender perfume and indignation, Miss Marple sat in silence. She thought of Mrs. Bowyer's change in demeanor, of Perk's clipped words, and of the foreign cuff still tucked in her sewing drawer. By mid-morning, the calm of the village was disrupted again, this time by raised voices from the public house. Miss Marple, walking the green under the guise of taking her weekly constitutional, caught the end of an argument between Oliver Jennings and the baker's son, Robert Hale. It was rare to see either young man lose composure, but now Oliver stood with his fists clenched, his collar half turned, while Robert's cheeks burned red. "She wasn't yours to speak for," Oliver hissed, his voice low but shaking. "You never understood that, and you never knew when to keep quiet," Robert spat. "If you've dragged her into this, so help me," Miss Marple coughed delicately from the edge of the path. Both young men fell silent and stepped back with the exaggerated innocence of boys. "Caught stealing from the jam shelf. Lovely morning," she said cheerfully. "A touch humid, but I dare say it'll lift by afternoon." They muttered awkward greetings, and Robert turned on his heel, stomping away toward the mill road. Oliver lingered. "Miss Marple," he said at last, "you know, don't you?" She smiled kindly. "What is it you believe I know, dear?" His shoulders slumped. "I didn't push Felix. I didn't like him, but I didn't hurt him. I never said you did. I was afraid you might think so. I know how it looked." Miss Marple reached out and gently touched his arm. "The truth," she said softly, "doesn't often live in how things look. It lives in how people act when they believe no one is watching." Oliver looked away. "There's something you should know. Elspeth, Miss Dyer, she and Felix. They weren't strangers. Go on. They met before she came here. Last spring, in Cambridge. He never mentioned it to anyone. She told me. After he died." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "And what sort of meeting was it?" She said he tried to charm her into some investment idea. Something about educational properties in India. She turned him down. Thought he was arrogant. Then suddenly, 3 months later, she's offered a post here. Here, of all places, and you think he arranged it. I don't know, but I think she suspects he did. And it frightened her. She won't say it outright, but that's why she avoids people. Why she flinches. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. "Thank you, Oliver," she said at last. "I believe Miss Dyer has been trying very hard to vanish politely. That often speaks more than shouting ever could." That evening, the village hall was filled with the murmurs of a rather unexpected gathering. Lady Sybil had agreed to host the rescheduled Historical Society meeting, ostensibly to move forward with dignity. Several residents attended, not for the business of artifacts and minutes, but in the hopes of hearing something whispered behind fan programs and forced smiles. Miss Marple sat quietly in the third row. Lady Sybil stood before the group with her usual poise, but there was a new stiffness to her bearing, as though she were balancing something invisible and fragile on her shoulders. "I will not speak at length," she said, "but I will say this: my nephew's death, however tragic, will not alter the integrity of this village. There are legacies that go beyond legal entitlements." Behind her, Mr. Perks shifted uncomfortably. After the meeting, Miss Marple found herself momentarily alone with Lady Sybil by the side table of biscuits and sherry. "You spoke very well," Miss Marple said gently. "I wasn't sure I would," Lady Sybil replied. "There's a weight to silence, isn't there? And to words that must be said despite it." Miss Marple studied her. "Do you believe Felix meant to sell Westerham piece by piece?" Lady Sybil's jaw tightened. "He threatened to. He said it was time to shed the past. But what he meant, Jane, was, you don't matter anymore. And now he's gone." Lady Sybil nodded. "Now he's gone." Outside, the air was thick with midsummer heaviness. Thunder growled somewhere beyond the ridge dot as Miss Marple returned to her cottage. She reviewed the day's confrontations, whispered truths, rising tempers, and a secret relationship kept hidden by shame or fear. The storm clouds, she thought, were not only in the sky, they were gathering in their hearts to dot something someone was close to breaking. Chapter 8. Another twist, a second crime, or a shocking revelation. It began quietly, as these things often did. Monday morning brought with it the gray hush of rain clouds and the scent of sodden earth. Miss Marple, having taken her breakfast by the hearth, settled into her chair with her embroidery, though her hands moved more slowly than usual. Her thoughts elsewhere. By midday, the stillness of the village was pierced by a flurry of activity centered on the old footpath near Whitlow's Copse, where the mailman, Stanley Briggs, had stumbled across something decidedly out of place: a brown valise, soaked through, resting half-buried in the hedgerow. Its contents were strangers still: several charred scraps of paper, the scent of paraffin clinging to them, a brass keyring with the initials FC engraved, and a half-burned envelope bearing the watermark of Gray and Tilson solicitors. Word of the discovery spread with a speed that rivaled the summer lightning that had scorched the western sky the night before. By early afternoon, Inspector Ledger had arrived, trousers damp to the knee and boots caked in mud. The suitcase had been taken to the station and its contents laid out like relics from a drowned century. Miss Marple arrived not long after, politely invited, though Ledger would never admit to having sent for her. She peered at the contents with a faint frown. "A curious thing," she murmured. "Someone attempted to destroy these documents, yet chose to leave them exposed to be found. If one truly wanted to hide something, well, hedgerows are notoriously public places." Ledger nodded grimly. "It's as if they wanted us to find just enough to raise questions, not answers," Miss Marple added. "Only questions." He picked up the scorched envelope with tweezers. "There was a name here once. It's mostly gone, but we can just make out the beginning of it. Edie, that could be Dyer, couldn't it?" Miss Marple said nothing. "You think I'm jumping to conclusions?" Ledger asked after a pause. I think the path between a question and its answer can be far more crooked than it appears. Inspector, he looked at her for a long moment, then sighed. Well, you're not wrong. But the fact remains this valise belonged to Felix, and someone tried to burn it. That evening, Miss Marple took a walk in the drizzle. The roads were nearly empty, the air thick with the hush of anticipation as though something more were coming. She passed the schoolhouse just before dusk. Its lights were still on, though lessons had ended hours before. A single figure moved inside, Miss Elspeth Dyer, standing motionless by the blackboard. Miss Marple paused only a moment before continuing on, but she noted the angle of the woman's shoulders tight, defensive, and the strange, blurred mark on the inside of the glass, as if a palm had pressed against it and dragged down. By nightfall, the second twist had made its full entrance. At exactly 9 o'clock, the village constable was called to the vicarage, where the Reverend Underbarrow stood pale and shaken, holding out a small parcel that had arrived without sender. Inside it, a single sheet of typewritten paper, unsigned. A confession, or something that appeared to be one. I was there. I saw what happened. He was already dead before he fell. I didn't push him, but I didn't stop it either. I feared what he would do if I spoke up. I still do. It was unsigned. No envelope. The note had been folded twice and left in the vicar's letterbox sometime between evening service and supper. The handwriting matched nothing in the police files, and the typewriter used was old, perhaps even from the schoolhouse. There were no fingerprints, none that could be lifted, at least. But Miss Marple, informed by Ledger at once, had already begun drawing connections, not between ink and keys, but between intentions. Why send the note to the vicar and not the police? Why type it, if not to disguise the hand? Why admit guilt, but stop short of naming names? She turned over the paper herself, examining the texture. Not new, slightly brittle, the sort used in older stock, perhaps scavenged from school supply cupboards, or a solicitor's long-forgotten drawer. She asked only one question: may I keep it overnight? Ledger hesitated, then nodded. You won't take it out of the village. I won't take it out of my handbag. That night, as thunder grumbled across the hills once more, Miss Marple laid out the chain of events in her mind, linking one broken fragment to another. Felix Cargill dead from a fall no one saw. A window supposedly sealed for a decade, opened without damage. A foreign cuff in the grass. A woman with a past connection, visibly unraveling. A burnt valise containing legal documents and keys, Felix's keys. And now, a confession carefully shaped to seem incomplete, and yet no second death. Not yet. This was not a new crime, but rather a second revelation. A tremor in the ground. A warning, perhaps. By morning, the village was a cauldron of speculation once again. Mrs. Drake claimed she'd seen a shadow in the bell tower during the storm. Mr. Appleton believed someone was attempting blackmail, and Mrs. Fanshawe suggested, in full theatrical voice at the butcher's, that a ghost might be trying to confess posthumously. Miss Marple said nothing to anyone, not even to young Oliver, who looked paler than usual and walked with his shoulders hunched against the wind. Instead, she returned to her garden, took a slip of rose from the last of the summer bloom, and clipped it gently into water. As she placed the delicate cutting into a glass, she thought of the note, the valise, and the odd timing of it all. It was not an ending, she knew. It was a signal, a curtain, slowly beginning to rise. Someone was afraid not of being caught, but of being remembered. And Miss Marple, sharp-eyed and endlessly patient, intended to remember everything. Chapter 9. Hidden Connections. The web of lies deepens. Tuesday morning arrived without thunder, though the heaviness in the air remained like a word unspoken or a truth just beyond reach. The sky was low and metallic, and a cold breeze had begun teasing the hedgerows, rustling their early yellowing leaves. In St. Anscombe-on-Mere, summer was ending, but the mystery, if anything, was blooming into something thornier. Miss Marple stood at her parlor window with a teacup in hand, watching the village unfold its usual routines. But her eyes weren't on the grocer's cart or the postman's circuit. They were on the schoolhouse. It was Miss Dyer who puzzled her most, not because she had secrets most people did, but because her secrets seemed tied, not only to Felix Cargill's fall, but to something older, more entangled. Fear, yes, but also guilt. And guilt had a particular flavor, evasive, yes, but never entirely concealed. By mid-morning, Miss Marple made her way to the library under the pretext of collecting a book on estate law. Miss Dyer was there already, seated in the far corner, reading from a red leather volume and pretending not to notice Miss Marple's entrance. But the librarian, Mr. Lomax, had already noticed them both. "She's here every day this week," he whispered, voice muffled behind the checkout desk. "Says she's researching a lesson. Funny sort of lesson, if you ask me. Keeps pulling out the same book Hayward family records. Barely reads it though. Just stares." Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "People look for patterns, Mr. Lomax, even when they aren't sure what they're seeing." She selected a few books and wandered casually toward the reference section. Miss Dyer did not look up, but Miss Marple could see the tension in her shoulders. The red leather volume she read now was not a novel or historical text. It was a school register archived, decades old. That, too, was curious. Outside, on the way back, Miss Marple stopped at the greengrocer's and crossed paths with Mrs. Bowyer. The housekeeper looked worn, thinner than usual, with the pale, jumpy demeanor of someone suppressing a truth for too long. "I didn't see anything," she said abruptly as Miss Marple greeted her. "Nor did I ask," Miss Marple replied gently. Mrs. Bowyer looked at her for a moment. "They'll blame me if I say too much, but I think perhaps I ought to say something after all." She glanced around and lowered her voice. "Felix was meeting someone," she whispered. "Not in the house he wouldn't dare with Lady Sybil about, but somewhere nearby. Late evenings. I saw him slip out through the garden gate by the yew hedge. He always wore the same coat and carried that brown valise. The one they found burned." "When was this?" "The night before the garden party. Just past 11. He was whispering with someone, couldn't see who, but I heard a woman's voice. Not Sybil's, not Miss Dyer's either. Younger. Could it have been Elspeth Dyer's voice? Simply in distress?" Mrs. Bowyer shook her head. "No, it wasn't quiet, Jane. It was furious. That evening," Miss Marple pored over her notes again. "The register Miss Dyer had been studying. Felix's secret meetings. The forged confession. The letter nearly burned. The valise left to obviously an AHEDGEROW. It was all a performance, but not by one actor. By several. Later that same night, another whisper of truth crept into the open. The constable, Harrow, arrived at Miss Marple's door just after supper. Hat in hand. "I probably shouldn't tell you," he said, "but it's strange enough. I think you'd know what to make of it." "What is it, dear?" "We had an anonymous call at the station. Male voice. Local, I'd say, but trying not to sound it. Said to check the ledgers at Gray and Tilson, the solicitor's firm. Said Felix had been trying to rewrite Lady Sybil's will. Not forge it exactly, but reframe it. Transfer assets to a different name. Whose name? Didn't say. But here's the odd thing. One of the new staff at Gray and Tilson resigned suddenly last week. Left without collecting pay." Miss Marple leaned forward. "A woman." Harrow nodded. "That's the rumor. Temporary secretary, young, dark hair, clean accent. Left her address blank. And no one knows her name? They think it was Miss Wren, but that's likely false." Miss Marple's mind moved quickly. A mystery secretary, a restructured will, a valise burned but not destroyed, a voice in the night that wasn't Elspeth Dyer's, and then she remembered something else. a phrase Lady Sybil had spoken days earlier. There are legacies that go beyond legal entitlements. Suddenly, it was clear. This wasn't only about who had killed Felix, that it was about who he had tried to erase. The next morning, Miss Marple made 2 visits. The first was to Lady Sybil. They sat again in the shadowed morning room, the scent of dust and lavender still in the air. "Did Felix threaten you?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Or someone else you cared for?" Lady Sybil stared out the window. "He said he'd discovered something. Said he could undo the trust. That he had rights as heir. Did he mean a child?" Lady Sybil didn't speak for a long time. Then he found a name. A girl's name. Years ago, his father had an affair with one of the maids. I paid the family to leave quietly, but she had the child. Felix found out. He wanted to contest the inheritance to transfer it to himself fully. Remove any trace of the girl's rights. Do you know who she is? I never did. The mother left no forwarding address, but I always assumed she'd return, or her child would. Miss Marple thanked her and left. Her second visit was to Miss Dyer. The schoolmistress looked pale and sleepless, her hands trembling as she opened the door. "I know why you came," she said, "do you? I'm not the child. That's what you were wondering, isn't it? Felix thought I might be, which is why he followed me from Cambridge. But he was wrong. I never knew my father, but it wasn't him. Then why the fear? Because Felix used that mistake. He said if I didn't keep quiet about something, I saw something he did, he'd ruin me. Ruin everything. He said he'd plant evidence. He had friends, power. What did you see?" Miss Dyer's voice dropped. "He struck someone, a woman, outside the house, 2 nights before he died. I saw it from the schoolhouse window. She was crying. He hit her. She fled. He laughed. Do you know who she was?" Miss Dyer shook her head, but Miss Marple now suspected she did. The threads were beginning to tangle into something tight. A secret child, a frightened witness, a forged will, a false confession, and now, a woman somewhere who had been hit, hurt, silenced, but not, perhaps, forever. Miss Marple rose from her seat and smoothed her skirt. She was ready, at last, to set the final stitches. Chapter 10. The final clue revealed. The day Miss Marple called everyone together dawned with peculiar clarity, as though the village itself had taken a deep breath after weeks of holding it in. The leaves on the green were beginning to crisp at the edges. Children were back in school uniforms, and for once the wind did stir, though no windows dared to open themselves. It was Lady Sybil's suggestion that the gathering be held at Westerham House, in the west drawing room, for formality's sake. It had once been used for croquet parties and county committee teas, but now it served a different purpose entirely. By 3 o'clock, the small group had assembled. Lady Sybil, composed but pale. Inspector Ledger, arms crossed with a look of official skepticism. Mrs. Bowyer, twisting her handkerchief. Oliver Jennings, nervous but upright. Miss Elspeth Dyer, who sat quietly in the corner, not quite meeting anyone's eyes, and standing near the hearth like a bishop readying for the final move in a long chess match. Miss Marple herself. She held nothing in her hands, no dossier, no newspaper clipping, no letter torn from a drawer, just her knitting bag, unopened at her feet, and the weight of knowledge gathered stitch by stitch. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice as gentle as always. "I don't believe in grand speeches, so I'll be plain. Felix Cargill did not fall. He was dead before he reached the ground." There was a rustle of breath. Lady Sybil said nothing, her eyes closed. Ledger started to interrupt, but Miss Marple lifted a single finger. No broken hands, no scrapes, no sign of struggle on the window frame, which we now know hadn't opened in years. And then there's the matter of the brown valise. Someone tried to destroy it, but left just enough to be found. Why? Because it wasn't meant to vanish, it was meant to be noticed. It contained evidence of Felix's plan to steal the estate through legal deceit, but the documents were incomplete. One critical page missing. Oliver stirred. You mean the page naming the new heir? Miss Marple nodded. It was never there, because Felix never got that far. He was trying to remove someone, not replace them. And I believe he had discovered the identity of a woman with legitimate claim to the estate, someone whose existence had been long buried. Lady Sybil opened her eyes. Miss Marple continued. Someone born years ago, quietly, out of wedlock. Someone Felix believed would be easier to scare away than to fight in court. He tried. He failed. Miss Dyer's fingers clenched in her lap. It wasn't Miss Dyer, Miss Marple said gently. She was a red herring, cleverly, tragically used. But not the heir. She turned, slowly, to the far end of the room. Mrs. Bowyer. May I ask, when did your daughter last visit you? The housekeeper blinked. My daughter? Yes, Mabel Bowyer, the one you sent away years ago. She worked in London, did she not? A quiet life. Married a tailor. Never spoke of her employer in St. Anscombe. Until last month. Mrs. Bowyer looked stricken. She came back, just for a night, to speak with Felix. He said he'd found something in the ledgers. Something about her. Miss Marple's voice softened. He discovered she was Sir Archibald's daughter, didn't he? Mrs. Bowyer's face crumpled. He said if she didn't sign away any claim, he'd tell everyone, ruin her, drag the family through scandal. She was frightened. She fled. But she came back again, just before the garden luncheon. I didn't know until later. Until she came to you in tears, Miss Marple finished. You hid her. You protected her. Inspector Ledger frowned. But that still doesn't explain. It explains everything, Miss Marple said calmly. Because the woman who confronted Felix that night, the one Miss Dyer saw him strike, was Mabel. And the man who found her, sobbing behind the hedge, was Oliver Jennings. Oliver flushed. She didn't kill him, Miss Marple said. But she wasn't alone. Her eyes moved, at last, to the last piece of the puzzle, Elspeth. She said gently, you were in the library. Miss Dyer looked up slowly, her voice a whisper. I heard them arguing. I was returning papers, Lady Sybil's donation to the school. The door was ajar. I meant only to pass by. But then he hit her, and she fell. I couldn't breathe. And when he turned his back, I pushed him. There was silence. Not hard, she continued. Not violently. Just enough. Enough to make him lose his balance. Miss Marple nodded. But Felix didn't fall from the window, no, said Elspeth. He stumbled back, hit his head on the corner of the desk. There was no need to push further. He was already dead. So you and Mabel staged the fall, Miss Marple said. Elspeth's hands trembled. We panicked. We thought if it looked like a fall, no one would look further. Mabel ran. I opened the window. I dropped him. The room was quiet for a long time. Inspector Ledger stepped forward, slow and measured. Miss Dyer, you understand I'll need to take a statement. She nodded, eyes lowered. I don't ask for mercy, no, said Lady Sybil, her voice suddenly strong. But you may deserve it. Elspeth looked up. Felix was a cruel man, Lady Sybil said. I see that now. And the estate, my estate, was nearly handed to a man who had none of my father's dignity. I thank you, Miss Marple, and I thank you, Miss Dyer, for sparing this place a darker future, even if it came at a price. Outside, the wind stirred the hedgerows once more, and inside, Miss Marple picked up her knitting bag. Her needles resting gently against each other, she said nothing more. She never did when the work was done.